Sometimes the moment that saves a powerful man's life begins with a voice no one expects to hear. I was only supposed to clean the floors. That was the job. Quiet steps. Head down. Don't speak unless spoken to. That was the first rule inside the Volkov estate. I learned it within 5 minutes of arriving. The house itself didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum built for someone who didn't care about comfort. Marble floors colder than winter sidewalks. Hallways stretching longer than a football field. Windows taller than 12 feet that let in pale morning light, but somehow made the place feel darker. Everyone who worked there moved carefully, like the air itself was watching. No one laughed. No one talked louder than a whisper. When I asked another maid where the cleaning supplies were kept, she glanced around before answering, like the walls might report her. Basement. Left hallway, she murmured. Then she added something that made my stomach tighten. And don't stare at the boss if you see him. The boss. That was how everyone referred to Adrian Volkov. Not Mr. Volkov. Not sir. Just the boss. I had heard the name before coming here. Everyone in the city had. Some people said he owned half the buildings downtown. Others said he could shut down entire businesses with a single phone call. No one ever said it loudly, though. His name traveled in quiet voices, like thunder heard through walls. My shift started at 6 in the morning. By 6:15, I had already cleaned 2 hallways and 1 massive staircase that probably cost more than my parents' house. By 6:20, I was pushing my cart toward the garage. The garage alone was bigger than most apartment buildings I had lived in. Smooth concrete floors, bright overhead lights, cars lined up like polished sculptures, black SUVs, a silver sports car that looked like it belonged on a racetrack, and 1 black Cadillac parked near the center like it was the king of the room. I didn't know much about cars, but even I could tell that one mattered. It was spotless, not a fingerprint on the door. My job was simple. Sweep. Wipe the floor edges. Move quietly. I pushed the mop bucket forward, and the wheels echoed softly in the giant space. The smell of motor oil mixed with clean detergent. For a moment, everything felt normal. Just another job. Just another morning. Then I saw it. At first it looked like nothing. Just a thin line under the back of the Cadillac. Maybe a loose cable. Maybe part of the car. But something about it didn't sit right in my chest. I stepped closer. The red wire was barely visible against the dark metal. Thin. Careful. Not something you would notice unless you were looking directly at it. My heart skipped once. Then twice. Footsteps echoed at the far end of the garage. Heavy. Confident. Several pairs moving together. I didn't need anyone to tell me who had just walked in. The room itself seemed to straighten. Guards in dark suits appeared first, scanning the space with quiet discipline. And then Adrian Volkov stepped into the light. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Tall. Calm. The kind of presence that made conversations stop before they even started. He walked directly toward the black Cadillac, while one of the guards opened the driver's door. My chest tightened. My eyes dropped back to the thin red wire beneath the car. Adrian slid into the driver's seat. His hand moved toward the ignition. And before I could stop myself, before I could remember the rule about staying quiet, I heard my own voice explode across the garage. Do not start your car. I realized the moment the words left my mouth that everyone in the garage had stopped breathing. The echo of my voice bounced off the concrete walls and hung in the air like something that should not exist there. A maid was not supposed to shout in the Volkov estate, especially not at Adrian Volkov himself. The guards reacted first. 3 of them stepped forward at the same time, their movements sharp and controlled, eyes locked on me like I had just triggered an alarm. The sound of shoes against concrete suddenly felt louder than a thunderstorm. I froze with the mop still in my hands. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might echo through the entire garage. Adrian Volkov had not turned the key yet. His hand rested on the ignition, fingers still. Slowly, very slowly, he lifted his eyes and looked at me through the open driver's side door. I had heard people describe his stare before. Cold. Calculated. The kind of look that made grown men lose their words. They were not exaggerating. When his eyes met mine, it felt like the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. For a second, I thought my legs might stop working. One of the guards spoke, his voice sharp and controlled. He asked who I was and why I was yelling. I could not answer him. My eyes kept drifting back to the thin red wire under the car. It was still there, still hanging where it should not be. Adrian followed my gaze. He stepped out of the Cadillac without slamming the door or raising his voice. Everything about him moved slowly, but nothing about him felt relaxed. Silence spread through the garage again. You could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant ticking of a cooling engine somewhere in the back. Adrian walked around the front of the car and stopped about 10 feet from me, close enough that I could see the faint lines near his eyes and the calm expression that somehow made him look even more dangerous. He did not ask the guards to remove me. He did not shout. He simply spoke in a voice so steady that everyone leaned in to hear it. He asked me why I had told him not to start the car. My mouth felt dry. For a moment, I wondered if I should pretend it was a mistake. Maybe say I dropped something. Maybe say I panicked. But the image of the red wire burned in my mind. I pointed toward the underside of the Cadillac with a shaking hand. I told him there was something under the car that did not look right. One of the guards immediately crouched down and leaned toward the rear axle. Another guard stepped beside him with a flashlight, even though the garage lights were already bright. The beam slid across the polished metal, then stopped. The crouching guard went completely still. A long second passed. Then another. When he finally looked up, the color had drained from his face. He spoke quietly, but every word carried through the garage like a dropped glass. He said there was a device connected to the starter system. Adrian did not react the way I expected. He did not shout. He did not move. He simply looked back at me, studying my face like I was a puzzle that suddenly appeared in the middle of his morning. Then he asked a question that made the entire room turn toward me again. He asked how a maid on her first day of work knew to look under his car. I did not answer right away because the truth sounded ridiculous even inside my own head. Adrian Volkov stood 10 feet away from me, waiting with the patience of someone who had never needed to repeat a question in his life. Around him the guards stayed perfectly still, like statues placed around a monument. The man kneeling beside the car was still staring at the device under the chassis, his flashlight beam trembling slightly against the metal frame. My throat felt tight. I forced myself to breathe slowly before speaking. I told him I was not looking for anything special. I was just cleaning the floor like I had been told. The mop wheels rolled over a small crack in the concrete, and that was when I noticed the wire hanging lower than it should have been. I said it did not look like part of the car. It looked like something added later. Adrian did not interrupt me. His eyes stayed on my face the entire time. They were not angry the way I expected. They were focused, studying every word like it mattered. One of the guards carefully slid farther under the Cadillac, examining the connection point near the starter housing. Another guard spoke quietly into a radio, his voice low enough that I could not understand the words. The air in the garage felt heavier with every second. Finally, the guard beneath the car backed out slowly. He stood up and brushed dust from his suit jacket, though there was barely any dust on the floor to begin with. He said the device was connected directly to the ignition trigger. If the engine had started, the system would have activated instantly. His voice stayed calm, but the meaning behind his words settled into the room like a storm cloud. Adrian nodded once. Just once. Then he looked at the Cadillac again before turning his attention back to me. I suddenly became very aware that I was still holding the mop handle like a shield. He asked me how long I had been working in the house. I told him it was my first morning. His eyebrow lifted slightly, the smallest change in expression, but it felt like the entire room had shifted. A new maid. On her first day, and she had just stopped him from starting his car. One of the guards looked at me again, this time with a different kind of curiosity. Adrian stepped a little closer, reducing the distance between us to maybe 8 feet. Close enough that I could see the reflection of the garage lights in his dark eyes. He asked another question, softer this time. He asked if I had ever seen a device like that before. I hesitated. The honest answer sat right on the edge of my tongue. Saying it out loud would change everything about how these people saw me. For a moment I considered lying. I could say it was just a lucky guess, a random observation. But my mind flashed back to a memory I had spent years trying to forget. A garage smaller than this one. A different car. The same thin wire leading somewhere it should not go. My hands tightened around the mop handle. I told him yes. The word left my mouth quietly, but it carried across the silent room. Adrian tilted his head slightly. His voice stayed calm when he asked the next question. He asked where a maid like me would have learned to recognize something like that. I could feel every pair of eyes in the garage resting on me, waiting for my answer. The question sounded simple, but the truth behind it carried years of memories I had tried to bury. Adrian Volkov did not rush me. He stood there with the quiet patience of a man who knew the world would eventually answer him. The overhead lights reflected off the polished hood of the Cadillac, while the guard near the front kept the flashlight pointed at the device under the car, as if afraid to look away from it. I swallowed slowly and told Adrian that I had seen something similar once before. Not in a place like this. Not in a mansion with marble floors and guards at every corner. I told him it happened years ago in a small auto repair shop outside Cleveland where my uncle used to work. The shop sat beside a highway exit and smelled like motor oil and old rubber tires. When I was younger, I spent a lot of afternoons there doing homework at a metal table while my uncle fixed engines. He used to say that cars were like puzzles. If you learned how the pieces fit together, you could tell when someone had forced a piece into the wrong place. One evening a truck came into the shop with a strange problem. The owner said the engine would not start, but my uncle noticed a thin wire connected to a part of the ignition system that did not belong there. He spent an hour explaining to me why that wire was dangerous and why certain people sometimes attach devices like that to vehicles. I did not understand everything back then, but I remembered the look on his face when he found it. Serious. Focused. The same look I had just seen on the guard kneeling beside the Cadillac. When I finished speaking, the garage fell silent again. Adrian listened without interrupting. His expression did not change, but I could tell he was thinking carefully about every word. One of the guards stepped closer to him and spoke quietly, confirming that the device was connected exactly where I had pointed earlier. Adrian gave a small nod, and the guard moved away to speak into his radio again. The sound of his voice echoed faintly through the large space before fading into the distance. Adrian turned his attention back to me. For the first time since the shouting, his eyes softened slightly, not with kindness exactly, but with something closer to curiosity. He asked me what my uncle did when he found that wire years ago. I told him my uncle removed it carefully and reported it to the local police because he believed someone had tried to sabotage the vehicle. Adrian looked toward his Cadillac again, then back at me. The silence stretched long enough that I began to wonder if I had said too much. My hands were still wrapped around the mop handle, and I suddenly felt embarrassed standing there in a cleaning uniform while everyone else wore tailored suits. Finally, Adrian spoke again, his voice calm but thoughtful. He said it was unusual for someone to notice such a small detail while simply cleaning a garage floor. I told him I almost ignored it at first, but something about the wire looked wrong, and my uncle always said that small details were the ones that mattered most. Adrian studied my face for another quiet moment. Then he asked a question that made my pulse jump again. He asked who hired me to work in his house. I felt the weight of Adrian Volkov's question settle over the garage like the quiet before a storm. Who hired me? It sounded simple, but the way he asked it made it feel like the most important detail in the world. I tightened my grip on the mop handle and tried to keep my voice steady. I told him the agency downtown sent me. Carter Domestic Services on West Madison Street. They had placed me in several houses before, mostly small places owned by busy professionals who needed someone to keep their kitchens and living rooms clean. Nothing like this estate. Nothing with gates taller than 12 feet and security cameras watching every driveway. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. One of the guards beside him quietly repeated the agency name into his radio. Somewhere beyond the garage walls, another voice responded, too faint for me to understand. The guard nodded once and stepped back into position. Adrian slowly walked toward the Cadillac again, stopping near the front bumper where the flashlight beam still pointed under the chassis. The guard crouched there, shifted slightly, so Adrian could see the device more clearly. The boss leaned down just enough to study the wire and the small metal casing attached near the starter assembly. Even without touching it, he seemed to understand exactly what he was looking at. After a moment, he straightened and looked across the garage at the row of vehicles parked along the wall. His voice was calm when he spoke, but it carried through the space with quiet authority. He told one of the men to make sure every vehicle in the garage was inspected immediately. The guard nodded and moved quickly toward the far end of the building. Adrian then turned back toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I suddenly felt very small standing there in my cleaning uniform, while the most powerful man in the city studied my face like he was trying to read something hidden behind my eyes. I wondered if he believed my story about the repair shop. I wondered if he believed I was just a maid who noticed something strange. Finally, he took a slow step closer. The distance between us shrank to only a few feet. Up close, he looked even calmer than before, which somehow made the moment more intimidating. He asked me how long I had known about my job here before today. I told him the agency called me yesterday afternoon and said a new position had opened. They asked if I could start this morning at 6 o'clock. I needed the work, so I agreed. Adrian nodded slightly, as if placing another piece into a puzzle only he could see. Then he asked if anyone had contacted me after the agency called. I shook my head. No phone calls. No messages. Just the address and the starting time. The garage remained quiet except for the faint sound of tools moving in the distance as the guards began inspecting the other cars. Adrian studied me for several seconds more before speaking again. His tone remained even, but the words carried a new kind of weight. He said that sometimes dangerous plans relied on very small coincidences. Then he looked directly into my eyes and asked the question that made my pulse jump once again. He asked if I still believed coming to work here this morning was only a coincidence. I looked at Adrian Volkov, and for the first time since entering the garage, I did not know what the correct answer was supposed to be. His question lingered in the air between us, heavy and quiet. Did I still believe coming to work here was only a coincidence? I wanted to say yes immediately. That would have been the simplest answer. I was just a maid who needed a paycheck. A girl who showed up at 6 o'clock in the morning with a mop and a bucket. Nothing more. But standing there under the bright garage lights, with guards inspecting every vehicle and a device still attached to the underside of the Cadillac, the word coincidence suddenly felt fragile. I took a slow breath and told him that yesterday afternoon it had seemed like pure luck. A new job, better pay than most cleaning positions, and a house close enough to the city that I would not spend 2 hours on the bus every morning. I said that at the time I did not question it. People look for work and sometimes they find it. That was how life usually worked for someone like me. Adrian listened carefully, his expression steady. I could not tell if my answer satisfied him or made him more suspicious. Behind him, one of the guards walked past carrying a small tool kit, heading toward another black vehicle parked near the far wall. The quiet clink of metal echoed softly across the concrete floor. Adrian folded his hands loosely in front of him and glanced once more toward the Cadillac before returning his attention to me. He asked what time the agency called me yesterday. I thought about it for a moment and told him it was a little after 3 in the afternoon. I remembered because I had just finished a shift cleaning an office building and I was standing at a bus stop when the call came through. The woman from the agency said the position had opened suddenly and the homeowner needed someone reliable to start immediately. Adrian nodded slowly, as if the time itself mattered to him. One of the guards nearby received another radio message and walked over to speak quietly with him. I heard only a few words. Agency confirmed. Background check clear. No connections found. Adrian listened without reacting. When the guard finished speaking, he stepped back again and the garage returned to its uneasy silence. Adrian looked at me with the same focused calm he had shown since the beginning of this strange morning. He said that sometimes when someone plans an attack, they rely on timing more than anything else. They count on the right moment, the right distraction, the right person standing in the right place. I felt a small chill move down my spine. I told him I did not understand why anyone would choose me as part of a plan like that. I was just a cleaner. Adrian studied my face for another long second. Then his gaze drifted toward the red wire beneath the Cadillac again. When he spoke, his voice was quieter but even more serious than before. He said that was exactly the question he intended to answer. Then he looked back at me and added something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. He said that until he found that answer, I would not be leaving the estate. I did not understand what he meant at first. The words sounded calm, almost polite, but the meaning behind them made my chest tighten. I would not be leaving the estate. For a moment I wondered if I had heard him correctly. The garage suddenly felt much larger and much smaller at the same time. Larger because the space around me seemed to stretch endlessly under the bright lights. Smaller because every exit now felt very far away. I looked at Adrian Volkov, trying to read his expression. He was not angry. He was not threatening. He simply looked like a man who had made a decision. The kind of decision that did not change once it was spoken. One of the guards nearby shifted slightly, as if the statement had been expected. Another man finished checking the second vehicle and quietly reported that nothing unusual had been found. Adrian nodded once without looking away from me. I realized then that everyone in the room was waiting to see how I would react. I swallowed and asked the only question that came to my mind. I asked if he believed I had something to do with the device under the car. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering. He said belief was not the right word. He said he dealt in information, not assumptions. At the moment, there were two facts. The first fact was that someone had placed a device in his vehicle. The second fact was that I was the person who noticed it before anyone else. He said those two facts were connected whether either of us liked it or not. His tone was steady, almost thoughtful, as if he was explaining a simple equation. I felt heat rise in my face. I told him I had never even seen his house before this morning. I told him I did not know anyone who worked here, and I definitely did not know anything about whatever someone had attached to his car. Adrian listened carefully while I spoke. When I finished, he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that my answer made sense. Then he surprised me by saying that was exactly why he wanted me to remain here for now. If someone had planned this carefully, they would expect everything to unfold in a predictable way. The device would be discovered later. Questions would be asked. Investigations would begin. But the presence of a maid who noticed the wire before the engine even started was something no one could have predicted. I frowned slightly, trying to follow his reasoning. Adrian glanced toward the Cadillac again, then back at me. He said that unexpected details often revealed more truth than long investigations. Then he added something that made the room fall quiet again. He said if someone had placed that device expecting a certain outcome, they might also be watching to see what happened next. My eyes widened slightly as the meaning settled in. Adrian stepped back and gestured toward the open garage door that led into the main hallway of the estate. He told one of the guards to escort me inside and make sure I was comfortable. The guard nodded and walked toward me with calm professionalism. As I turned to follow him, Adrian spoke once more from across the garage. His voice carried easily through the space. He said that until he understood why I was the one who saved his morning, I would be considered both a guest and a mystery in his house. I followed the guard through the wide garage doorway and into the main hallway of the estate, and the sound of our footsteps changed instantly from echoing concrete to quiet marble. The difference was so sudden it almost felt like walking into another world. The hallway stretched ahead of us like something from a luxury hotel, with tall windows letting in soft morning light and walls decorated with paintings that probably cost more than every car I had ever owned combined. The guard walking beside me moved with calm, professional steps, the kind that made it clear he had done this job for years. He did not rush me, and he did not try to intimidate me. In fact, he seemed almost polite, which somehow made the situation feel even stranger. I realized I was still holding the mop handle, and the small cleaning bucket was rolling behind me with a quiet squeak from one wheel. After a few seconds, the guard glanced down at the bucket and gave a faint smile that barely touched his face. He told me someone would take care of the cleaning equipment and that I did not need to worry about work right now. That sentence alone felt unreal. I had shown up expecting a long morning of scrubbing floors and wiping counters. Instead, I had just stopped the most powerful man in the city from starting his car, and now I was apparently being escorted through his house like an important visitor. We turned a corner and entered a sitting room larger than most apartments I had lived in. A wide fireplace stood against the far wall, and a row of tall shelves held dozens of books arranged with careful precision. Sunlight filtered through curtains that moved slightly in the morning breeze from an open window somewhere down the hall. The guard gestured toward a comfortable chair near the center of the room and told me I could sit there while things were sorted out. I lowered myself into the chair slowly, still trying to understand how this had become my morning. The guard stepped aside and spoke quietly into a small radio clipped to his jacket. His voice stayed calm and professional, reporting that I was inside and waiting. A few moments later, another staff member entered the room carrying a glass of water and placed it on the small table beside me. She smiled politely but did not ask questions, which told me that everyone in this house was used to unusual situations. When the door closed again, the room grew quiet. I wrapped my hands around the cool glass and tried to slow my breathing. My mind kept replaying the image of the thin red wire under the Cadillac and the way Adrian Volkov had looked at me after the guard confirmed the device was real. He had not looked grateful exactly. He had looked curious, like a man who had just discovered a piece of information he did not know he needed. A few minutes passed before the door opened again. This time it was not a guard who stepped inside. Adrian Volkov entered the room alone, his posture relaxed, but his eyes focused the same way they had been in the garage. He closed the door quietly behind him and walked a few steps closer before speaking. His voice was calm, almost conversational. He said that while his team was examining the situation in the garage, he had another question for the maid who had just changed the course of his morning. Then he looked directly at me and asked something that made my thoughts freeze again. He asked why out of everyone in that garage, I was the only person who looked under the car. For a moment, I did not know how to answer him because the truth sounded too ordinary to explain something so unusual. Adrian Volkov stood near the fireplace with the quiet patience of a man who had never needed to rush anyone in his life. The morning light from the tall window fell across the room and reflected faintly off the polished wood floor. I could hear distant footsteps somewhere deeper in the house, but inside the sitting room, everything felt still. I looked down at the glass of water in my hands before speaking. I told him that I did not plan to look under the car. I was just moving the mop across the floor like I had done in 100 other garages before. The wheel on the cleaning bucket caught a small crack in the concrete, and the bucket tilted slightly. When I bent down to steady it, that was when I saw the wire. It was not curiosity that made me notice it. It was the same instinct my uncle tried to teach me years ago in that repair shop near the highway. When something does not belong, your eyes recognize it before your mind does. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression calm but attentive. I continued speaking because the memory had already started unfolding in my mind. I told him that my uncle always said machines tell the truth if you look closely enough. Every bolt and every cable has a purpose. When something appears where it should not be, it is usually there for a reason. I explained that when I saw the thin red wire hanging lower than the other parts under the car, something inside my head immediately said it was wrong. Not dangerous yet, just wrong. And once I noticed it, I could not ignore it anymore. Adrian walked a few steps closer and rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair across from me. His eyes remained steady, studying every word. He asked if I had considered staying silent. The question made me pause. I thought about the moment again. The garage lights. The black Cadillac. His hand moving toward the ignition. I told him honestly that for 1 second I almost said nothing. I was new in the house, and everyone had already warned me not to cause problems. But my uncle had another rule he repeated whenever he found something unusual in a car. He used to say that ignoring a small warning today usually creates a much bigger problem tomorrow. Adrian was quiet for a moment after I finished speaking. The corners of his mouth shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to recognition. He said that rule sounded surprisingly wise for a mechanic in a small repair shop. I shrugged lightly and said my uncle believed that paying attention to details could save people a lot of trouble. Adrian looked toward the window where sunlight was now spreading slowly across the floor. Then he turned back to me with a thoughtful expression that felt different from before. Less suspicion, more curiosity. He said that in his world most people ignored details because they were too busy chasing larger things like money or power. Then he added something that made the quiet room feel suddenly important. He said that sometimes the person who notices the smallest detail is the one who changes the outcome of an entire day. His eyes met mine again as he spoke the final words in a calm, steady voice. He said that this morning I had done exactly that.